Are you feeling resentful because you are always doing what your partner wants? Do you often say yes to requests from others when you really want to say no? Do you feel like others are taking advantage of you and you just can't stop it? Or maybe you've said yes too many times and it's just taking all of your time. If you've answered yes to any of the above questions, you probably have or is suffering from a lack of boundaries. This is your co-host Bettina Davomar, inviting you to stay tuned to today's Life Transformation Show as we discuss the topic of boundaries with award-winning psychotherapist Michael Hart of Elim Counselling Services. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you very much, Bettina. And this is such a very important topic for us to be discussing today.
Yes.
Because when it comes to boundaries, we find that a lot of people suffer with putting in place healthy boundaries. So this topic for today, 6 steps for better boundaries, is a very appropriate and important topic for us to be discussing. I think especially, Bettina, when it comes to Christian circles where people have this sense of wanting to help and wanting to be of service to others, it is very easy to cross that line into where you start feeling resentful and bitter towards others because you have just extended yourself too much and you're doing too many things at the same time to the point where you're beginning to feel overwhelmed. But when it comes to boundaries, we see in scriptures that Jesus had a very good sense of establishing clear boundaries for himself.
Yes.
In John 6, verse 14 and 15, for example, we're told that when the people saw the signs that Jesus was performing, that they began to say, truly, this is the prophet who is come into the world. And they actually were so zealous about what Jesus was doing that we are told in that passage that they wanted to make him king. And it would have been so easy for Jesus to fall into this trap of thinking, they want me to be king. They need a king. And without proper boundaries, he could actually fall into that mindset of people pleasing, where he became the king of the people, and by so doing fall outside of the will of God. But Jesus had this very clear focus on what God's will was for his life. And as a result of that, he did not succumb to the pressure of the people who wanted to make him king. We see likewise in Luke 5, verse 15 and 16, that when the fame of Jesus spread around the regions of, of his time, and people became aware that this man had the potential and the capability of doing great miracles, that we are told that great crowds came out to hear him and to be healed of their sicknesses. But Luke 5 and verse 16 tells us, yet he frequently withdrew to the wilderness to pray. In other words, the people's agenda was not his agenda. He had a very clear sense of his limitations and the need to put proper boundaries in place. Can you imagine, Bettina, if Jesus didn't have proper boundaries and all of these people came out to be healed, and he's healing people from morning until night without any break because these people, they have desperate situations. What would have become of him?
Well, I think maybe he probably have some anxiety issues or maybe
Burnout
burnout or
issues.
stress.
A lot of the anxieties and illnesses that people have today, not in all cases, but in some cases, or I would even venture to say in many cases, is because they are not able to have proper boundaries in their lives.
Right.
And when it comes to boundaries, we're not just talking about boundaries with others, but boundaries also for yourself, in understanding the disciplines that you need to put in place so that you don't burn out yourself.
So, Michael, before we delve into this issue of boundaries, I think it's important that we define the word boundaries for our listeners this morning.
Yeah, so I think when you talk about boundaries, it's coming to this understanding of what it is that you are capable or willing to do for others in such a way that you do not put too much demand on yourself, or you do not become over engaged to the point where you're exhausted and resentful and bitter. So in other words, it's finding out what you find acceptable and unacceptable with the requests from others, but also the behaviors of others. So when we're talking about boundaries, we're not just talking about saying no to others, but we're also talking about the behaviors of other people towards you. So if you are in a relationship in which you find that there are inappropriate behaviors that you are not pleased with, or you're not willing to accept as part of a relationship, then healthy boundaries would mean that you would have a discussion with the person and say, this kind of behavior I find very disrespectful and demeaning, and I am not comfortable having this sort of behavior as part of our relationship. So again, it's what you find acceptable and unacceptable in terms of behavior and demands from others.
So, Michael, most people know that boundaries, setting boundaries is very important, but yet they fail to set them. Can you give maybe some examples from your experience of what kind of things may prevent people from actively, setting boundaries?
That's such a very good question, Bettina, because I think a lot of times we operate in this kind of autopilot mode where we find ourselves doing things, but we're not really aware of why we're doing them.
Yes.
And I think when it comes to boundaries and not being able to set better boundaries with others, it is often rooted in a lack of self-worth, where you're trying to appease others or to find worth by doing things to others. So if your self-worth is based on doing things for others, then it's very hard for you to say no, because the more you do, the more you feel that your self-worth is being built up. I think it can also be rooted in fears of abandonment and not being loved. So people who find themselves overextending themselves in relationship and giving in to that partner over and over again to the point where they realize it is all about you. There is nothing in this relationship for me, but yet they keep giving and giving. It could be because of a fear of abandonment.
Right.
People also carry wounds of not feeling lovable from childhood experiences. And so they may be thriving or striving to fill this need of wanting to be loved. So they feel that if I just give in, I will get love, I will feel loved, or I can't afford to say no, because if I say no, then people might not love me. I might not be liked by people as much as I want to be liked and desired. So they keep giving in and giving in and giving in.
And so, Michael, are there maybe some other areas that boundaries are violations in relationships?
Yes, there are a number of areas that I find in my practice that boundaries are violated. I think one of the very common areas where boundaries are violated is when it comes to time. So people are in relationship in which others place demands upon their time. So you might be in a marital relationship and your parents, for example, have expectations of how often they need to see you or see the grandchildren. And if you're not able to place proper boundaries to say, this is what work for us, I find that in many cases there is a silent silent river of resentment forming, because people are are giving in to the demands and they're extending themselves too much. So they're tired, they're exhausted, they've just come back from a trip with their family, but mom is expecting them to be there at a certain time on a certain day every week. And so they might not be able to say, today I can't make it because I am tired. So there are areas when it comes to time. I find also in the area of sexuality in romantic relationship, there are lack of boundaries in relation to sexual satisfaction or things that are sexually acceptable to a partner. There are some people, because of their lack of boundaries, they find it hard to say no in that area as well. And so they keep saying yes, and then they feel defiled, they feel as if their physical boundaries are violated because of the sexual demands that are put on them by their partner. And so it is so sad that there are many people who go through an entire lifetime putting up with things in the bedroom that they don't find pleasurable, but do not have the temerity, the intestinal fortitude to say, I don't like this, or this is not something that. So now about the six ways of building better boundaries. I think the first thing that we need to do, like if you're in a situation where you find that your boundaries are being violated, I think the first step in in restoring healthy boundaries is to document the ways in which your boundaries are being violated. Have a very clear picture of the areas. Is it pertaining to time? Is it pertaining to your sexuality? Is it pertaining to demands that people are putting on you? Is it pertaining to your opinion? And once you have a clear picture of these boundaries, the second step after documenting is counting the cost. And I think this is such an important step because many of us go through life without counting the cost that our actions are having on us. So if you're in a relationship where your boundaries are being violated in any or all, I hope that it's not all, but if your boundaries are being violated in many of these areas that we have talked about, what is the cost to you in terms of your mental health? What is the cost to you in terms of your happiness?
Right. This is so key, I think, Michael, because many people don't count the cost.
Yes.
Yeah.
People go through life just putting up with things and not realizing that it's costing them. So it's very important for them to count the cost and say, yes, I am unhappy because of this. And maybe it's something sexual where you can say, this is too painful. This is not something that I enjoy doing or I find pleasurable. What's the cost to your emotional health, your physical health, your self-worth? I think these first two steps of documenting and counting the cost is very important.
And so we know that we need to document ways that our boundaries are being violated. We also know that we need to count the cost. What is the third one?
The third step in building better boundaries is that you need to be able to identify the emotional reflex. And by emotional reflex, I mean that thing that drives you. And so if you have an emotional reflex, it is similar to a fight or flight response. The fight or flight response that we have talked about, where we say that it kicks in, and in our video that we did about overcoming anxiety and fear, which in 2 weeks have over 10,000 views on YouTube. I think in that video we talked about how the amygdala controls that fight or flight response. So if you have missed that show, I think it's a good show for you to watch because it goes into more detail in explaining the emotional reflex. But the emotional reflex is triggered by the amygdala, that part of the brain that often overrides the rational thought when there is fear or a threatening situation. So for people who cannot set better boundaries, there is an emotional reflex that is driving their decisions. So let me give an example of what this might look like in the work situation. So if you're in the work situation and you're taking on more and more work and you just can't say no, and you go home at night and you can't sleep because you're wondering, when am I going to get all of this done? But you go to work the next day and someone say to you, can you do this 20-page document? Can you write this 20-page document by next week? And you go, absolutely, I'll do that. And you take that on. That's the emotional reflex. The emotional reflex is to say yes. But once you have identified that you're having this reflex action to say yes, you need to identify what's driving it. So, in the example of the workplace situation, this could be driven by the fear that others might think that you're lazy, right? So when you have this emotional reflex, I don't want to seem lazy, and it's not something that you even think about in the moment. But when I sit down with my clients who are having this issue at work, and we begin to probe it, they will say, "Yes, that's how I feel." If I say no, and when I start look at it, do people really see you as being lazy in the workplace? The answer might be no. I'm a very hard worker. I have won so many awards because I go above and beyond. But the emotional reflex is I don't want to seem lazy. And so another emotional reflex could be in a romantic relationship where you say yes, yes, yes. But the emotional reflex is if I say no, I'm going to be abandoned. So the emotional reflex is this thing that bypasses the rational thinking and kicks in. So I think it's very important for us to identify what's driving it. I've read many books on boundaries, and I think that some of the books miss this very important step. And they give practical solutions first by saying you need to assert yourself. But what I am talking about here, it's not rational. It's a reflex action that bypasses your rational thinking.
Right.
And when I sit with my clients and I begin to assess, to talk about this, they realize that in many cases it's something that's just done automatically and they're not thinking about it. But the reflex is, I don't want to be abandoned. I don't want to seem lazy. I want to be loved. Or I want others to think highly of me. I want to be praised. And these reflex action are driving their behaviors and making them overwhelmed and burnt out.
Wow. Michael, that's a huge one. I think it's very common as well. And so I think that it's a really, really good that you pointed that out.
Right.
Now, the fourth one.
The fourth step is if you can identify your emotional reflex, what's driving it? Is it fear of abandonment? Is it fear of not being loved? Whatever it is, you need to now stop and assess that reflex. So now that you know what's driving it, is this a rational thought? And many of my clients who, once we assess that emotional reflex, they will say, no, this is not rational at all. I am the hardest worker. My boss loves me. Or I am with a very, very understanding spouse. And if I am to say no, it wouldn't be the end of the relationship. But somewhere in childhood, something happened that is predisposing this person to feel that your voice will not be heard. And this is often driven by a subconscious, unhealed emotional wound that is reigning in your subconscious and overrides how you do things rationally. So I think assessing that is very, very important.
What about identifying these emotional...
Yes, I think I alluded to that earlier when I said it's often in childhood. And so if you can identify, the Bible talks about knowing the truth and the truth making you free. Are you striving for the love of your father that you didn't get because your father was often critical and nothing that you do was good enough? So you're striving
for approval, maybe?
For approval, from your authority figures in your workplace. Or maybe you had a very demanding father or a demanding mother, that they were perfectionists and nothing that you do was ever good enough. And so you're striving harder and harder in the workplace. And so doing a report that is 90% accurate for you is not good enough. And so you keep working at that until you're burning out yourself and you become exhausted. These root causes are very, very important. And if you can identify them, the Bible says you will know the truth and the truth will make you free. I think this is a very important fifth step, to be able to identify the root cause.
Now the sixth and final step, Michael.
The sixth
Drum roll.
Yes. Da-da-da-da.
Yes.
So the sixth and final step is a step that I think comes too early in many of the books that are written on boundaries, because I think a lot of these books talks about asserting yourself, and this is the sixth step, to practice assertiveness. But you cannot practice assertiveness if that wound that is driving you, that emotional reflex that we talked about in step number 3, if that step is not dealt with, and step number 4, assessing to see if it's rational, you cannot get to and identifying the root cause, step number 5. You cannot get to step number 6 and practice assertiveness by saying, I will not do this, or I will not tolerate that behavior, because it has been driven by a deeper wound. So I think it is very, very important that once you have gone through this step, that you begin to practice. And it might be fearful at first, but if you take these little steps, and I would say baby steps, start slowly by saying no to one project and just see how that goes, and speak up about one issue with your partner. And I think as you begin to practice assertiveness, it will become easier and easier for you to do so. So if you have missed the video that we did on assertiveness, we did a whole podcast, I should say, on assertiveness, which is also on our YouTube channel. I don't have the time to go into that this morning, but please see that video on assertiveness. If you want the link for it, then please give us a call and we'll be happy to help you. But we see that today, Bettina, this show went by so fast.
Yes,
I can't believe it's the end already. Right. So we have to stop here for today. But we want to thank you so much for joining us in this episode of the Life Transformation Show. Remember to consider making a donation to this ministry. You can donate by going to our website, elimcounselingministry.com, or you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/Elim Counselling. Remember also that we have our past episodes, including this episode, which is going to be going up on our website soon. If you have missed the first part of it, you can access this through our website. And again, you can find this by going to our website and then accessing our social media page. And the website is elimcounselingministry.com. Elim is spelled E-L-I-M, counseling with 2 L's, ministry.com. And so we want to thank you again for joining us on this episode of the Life Transformation Show. And so until next time, this is your host, Michael Hart of Elim Counseling Services, praying that God would bless you in all your relationships and keep you sound in mind and pure in heart. Thank you very much for listening.